Chapter 31: How Submarines Killed the Freedom of the Seas. World power and an island empire created a greater need for the United States to use the ocean highways. Ever since the 1700s, the civilized nations had agreed on certain rules. Since wars were always going on somewhere in the world, the countries that were not at war were supposed to enjoy certain neutral rights. They were supposed to be able to carry on their commerce in peace. The most important of the neutral rights was the right to send ships anywhere, and to have their citizens be safe wherever they traveled. Warring nations, however, had the right to seize certain war materials, contraband, explosives, guns, and ammunition, even from neutral ships, but they were not supposed to seize other goods carried by neutrals. The rules required attackers to give warning before sinking any passenger ships. They also had to take the passengers on board and to do everything else reasonable to save civilians' lives. Since warships were large vessels, other ships could normally see them at a great distance. That, of course, automatically gave some warning, and it was not terribly hard for large warships to carry extra passengers. Diplomats called these rules international law. There was no court or police force to make nations obey them, but still they called them law because so many countries agreed they ought to obey the rules. Besides neutral rights, another name people gave these rules was the freedom of the seas. In 1914, when World War I broke out, neutral rights were still substantially the same as they had been for about 200 years. But the navies had changed. The most important change, a new kind of ship, the submarine, prowled the ocean. The submarine's greatest strength was its power to surprise. However, the submarine was also a crowded, tight-packed little vessel. With barely enough room for its own crew, food, and ammunition, it had nowhere to put passengers from any ships it might sink. To say that all warring nations had to follow the old rules would automatically outlaw the submarine. This would not have bothered Great Britain. She had the greatest navy in the world. She commanded the seas. But for Germany, with her relatively small navy, submarines could make all the difference. If Germany were to agree submarines were illegal, it would be another way of saying that Britain could forever rule the seas. Great Britain made it plain that she had no intention to give up her control of the oceans. She declared a blockade of Germany and enlarged the list of contraband to include all sorts of goods that neutrals had always been allowed to carry. Britain declared that she would even stop ships from carrying goods to neutral countries if any of those goods might eventually get to Germany. Of course, none of this was according to international law, but who would stand up to Great Britain? Germany figured no one could expect her to sit still and let Britain strangle her. Her submarines could stop the British blockade. The submarines may have to follow Britain's lead in disobeying international law, but Germany decided the risk was worth it. She decided to use her submarines for all they were worth, and to let others worry about the old rules. The German embassy sponsored warnings to go with advertisements in American newspapers for passenger ships heading to Britain. The British ship Lusitania planned to travel from the United States to Europe via Liverpool. Its ads included this warning from the German embassy. Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Of course, Cunard never told potential passengers that Lusitania would carry, besides the human passengers, millions of rounds of ammunition, 1,250 cases of non-explosive shrapnel, and 18 boxes of percussion fuses, all of which, under international law, made the ship contraband and liable to be sunk. On the night of May 7, 1915, the German submarine U-20 sank the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Relying on the German embassy's notice, it gave no additional warning. Of nearly 2,000 passengers on board, 1,198 died, including 128 Americans, no doubt partially because of the ammunition on board. The ship sank within 18 minutes of the time the torpedo hit. President Woodrow Wilson sent a strong protest to Germany. He insisted on neutral rights, and he said this meant the right of Americans to travel wherever they pleased, even on ships owned by the warring nations, and even in the midst of the war zone. Wilson said this was a matter of national honor. Woodrow Wilson's family background had not aroused his interest in naval or military efforts. His father was a Presbyterian minister who taught in a seminary. He wanted young Woodrow to train for the ministry. Woodrow decided against becoming a minister, but in some ways he always thought and talked like an old-fashioned minister. Like Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson was a literary president. He had written many books, but in almost every other way, he was Teddy Roosevelt's opposite. While Teddy Roosevelt's first book was on sea power, young Wilson wrote about moral questions for the North Carolina Presbyterian. While Teddy Roosevelt adored the strenuous life, Wilson lived in the world of ideas, longing to do immortal work. At the age when Teddy Roosevelt was learning to ride Broncos and was bunking with cowboys, Wilson was sitting in a postgraduate seminars on political science at Johns Hopkins University. Wilson was an indoor sort of man. After a bright career as a professor, he was elected president of Princeton University. His educational reforms there made him nationally famous. Then in 1910, he was elected governor of New Jersey, and in 1912, he received the Democratic nomination for president. He could inspire people in large groups or from the printed page, but face to face, he was stiff and standoffish. While Wilson had some of William Jennings Bryan's religious appeal, his tone was very different. Bryan sounded like the preacher at a country tent meeting, but Wilson could have been the minister of the best church in town. Both could persuade voters that they were joining the army of the Lord. Wilson, like Bryan, championed the struggling farmers and underprivileged workers, but as a more moderate kind of Bryan, Wilson had a wider appeal, and so he became president of the United States in 1913. In 1916, 2 years after the outbreak of the war in Europe, Wilson was re-elected president on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but one thing after another took Americans further down the road to war. The German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a foolish message to the German ambassador in Mexico. Zimmermann asked Mexico to join the German side, and in return, Germany promised to help the Mexicans recapture from the United States all of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The British intercepted and decoded the message, and then they eagerly relayed it to the United States. Meanwhile, powerful unseen forces drew Americans naturally like a magnet toward the British. After all, the British and Americans both spoke the English language. Their laws were built on the same English foundations. The Americans had fought their war for independence in order to preserve their rights as Englishmen. Beyond that, early in the war, the British succeeded in cutting the transatlantic cable that had brought news to America direct from Germany. After that, the English enjoyed a monopoly on the content and form of news Americans received from Europe. They were able to bend the news to their own advantage, and this gave the British a great advantage that very few Americans noticed. Even before the United States declared war, it was already supporting the British side. Because of the British blockade against Germany and her allies, the value of American goods sent to Germany and Austria plummeted from nearly 170 million in 1914 to about 1 million in 1916. During the same 2 years, American trade with Britain and her allies rocketed from 800 million to over 3.2 billion. While the United States was still technically neutral, American bankers had actually loaned the British allies $2.3 billion to buy war supplies. On April 2, 1917, within a month after the British uncovered the Zimmermann Note, President Wilson went to Congress to demand a declaration of war against Germany. He no longer spoke about neutral rights. He would not ask Americans to die for a technicality. The world, Wilson said, must be made safe for democracy. Americans must fight for the rights and liberties of small nations, to bring peace and safety to all nations, and to make the world itself at last free. There was, in fact, a good reason why the United States did not want to see the British lose. While European nations had spent their treasure on armies and navies, Americans had put their own wealth into schools, factories, and railroads, into a better life for all citizens. Why had Americans been able to go about their business in peace? One reason was British sea power. Britain had protected the United States. While the friendly British ruled the waves, they let U.S. ships carry cargo and people all over the world. The British, like the Americans, did not want to see other European nations build new empires in North or South America. The British Navy had actually enforced the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that European countries should not make new colonies in America, and should not interfere in American affairs. It had been very economical and extremely convenient, then, for Americans to have the British control the seas, but no one could predict what might come from a victorious Germany with its new imperial ambitions. And so the United States went to war in behalf of the British and their allies. In January 1918, 2 months after the fighting stopped, President Wilson went before Congress again, this time to explain the American program for the future of the world. He listed 14 points. They were a noble list, and if they could have been lived up to, there would never have been any more wars. Among Wilson's goals, to abolish all secret diplomacy. Wilson wanted to make political leaders ashamed to barter away other people's lives and liberties. To restore freedom of the seas. To adjust national boundaries so that all peoples could govern themselves. And finally, to create a League of Nations that would preserve peace and ensure justice. The 14 points impressed the world. They meant more to people outside the United States than any American statement since the Declaration of Independence or the Emancipation Proclamation. President Wilson had proved himself one of the greatest preachers in modern history. He had lifted the spirits of the battle-worn, and he expressed the hopes of millions everywhere. But to make even half his dreams come true required a master politician. Could he do the job?